Hi everyone, thanks for joining another video. I'm Michelle Crawford and today we're going to be painting another project from my Muse jar. If you haven't been following along, I pull a painting idea out of the Muse jar each week and come up with a tutorial to share along with you. So don't forget to subscribe here on YouTube, plus check out our Watercolor for Real Beginners Facebook group if you'd like to follow along with the weekly tutorials. Here we go. Today's project is candy. So we had a lot of really great projects show up in the group this week, and what I decided to paint were these giant jawbreakers. So it was a lot of fun using a lot of different wet on wet techniques and creating these fun splatters and just really having fun with color and creating this really, fun and colorful painting in the process. So let's jump right in by going over our supplies. I'm using Let's Make Art watercolor paper today. I really like this paper. It's pretty budget friendly and going to be great for this type of a project. We are going to be drawing the jawbreakers for our project today, so no worries. You will need a pencil and some type of a round object. Here I'm using the round tape roll that I have, and we're going to be really doing a simple drawing, good for any beginner. And of course I have a brush here that we'll be using when we paint the jawbreakers. I have my watercolor palette here, as well as 2 jars of water, one clean and one dirty, which will be important as we try out some fun wet and wet techniques. So we've got our supplies here. And if we look at the example project, you see we have 3 jawbreakers. 2 of them are whole, and then one of them here in the center is broken. You can see the layers inside of it, and so we'll paint that one a little bit differently. But as far as drawing these, it's pretty simple. They're essentially spheres, and to draw a sphere in 2D, you draw a circle. So I'm going to put the one on the left separate, not touching the other 2. So just kind of place your round object, use your pencil to trace it around. It doesn't have to be perfect. You can always lighten up these lines later. And then that one in the front, it'll still be round. We'll have kind of the front part of it. It will be cracked away. And so I'm drawing that one a little bit further down on my paper because it's going to be further toward me in the picture, and a little bit of contour line there to show where the smooth surface of the outside of it ends and where you are starting to see the inside of the jawbreaker. And there's lots of layers in here, so start with a larger circle in the middle and then just kind of give yourself some guidelines of where those concentric circles would be, showing all the different layers of colorful candy inside this giant jawbreaker. And so the other one is also whole. It'll be a circle, but we aren't going to draw the part that would be behind the one we have here in the middle. So place your object in about the same plane as the one on the left, and then we're going to draw around it just like we did before, but we're not going to draw where the 2 would overlap. So we'll just start on one side and draw all the way around with the pencil. So again, easy peasy, circles, semicircles, really simple. We'll also make a little bit of a surface here for them to sit on. And so just, really simply sketch out a horizon line, or, that surface that they'll be sitting on. And that is all there is to it. If you like the pencil lines, you can leave it as is, or if you'd like to see less of those in your final painting, you can always take an eraser. I'm using a kneaded eraser today to just lighten up and remove some of that graphite. Of course, I do want you to be able to see what I'm doing here today, so I won't remove too much, but you could lighten these up as much as you'd like, just so that you can see, a guideline for you to start using when we begin to paint. So pretty simple, really beginner-friendly drawing here, and I promise the painting is going to be just as easy, but probably a lot more fun. So to get started here, we'll open up our jars of water. I mentioned I have a clean jar here. This is going to be important for doing our wet and wet, and then a dirty jar here to rinse off my brush. In between, if you don't keep your jars clean and dirty the whole time, it's okay. It happens to to us all the time, but I promise it'll be fine. So the way that we're going to do this wet and wet technique is by first wetting up the paper where we'll be painting the outside layer of these Jawbreakers. So the one on the left, of course, will be a full circle, and the one on the right, we'll just paint the part of it that we see. And we'll be dropping in different colors, and you can see I'm using the primary colors here. Both a cool set of primaries as well as a warm set. You can choose, whichever colors, you want on your palette. But if you'd like to learn a little bit more about, the difference between these, I'll link a video down below. Anyhow, let's get to the painting here. So this wet on wet technique is really a lot of fun. You can use it to make a lot of different backgrounds and textures, and I thought that it would be just the perfect technique to kind of bring these giant Jawbreakers to life through watercolor. So our first step is to just take your brush in some clean water and start to wet up the circle on the left. With watercolor, we'll be doing dropping pigment into this wet area, but with watercolor, it should not flow. The paint that we place later will not flow past the line of water that we have here. We also want to make sure this area is equally wet. You don't want to have water pooling in certain areas or others, and you do want it to kind of maybe absorb a little bit into the paper. If you're using kind of cheaper paper, you might need a little bit more water. It might possibly dry faster, but what you're looking for is this nice sheen on your paper. Again, there's no puddles or drips happening, and so that's how you have the right amount of wetness and moisture. You can always add more if you need to, or refine some of your edges. And if you do end up with too much water, just dry your brush on your towel and you can sop that right back up. So again, just get it completely evenly wet. And now that we've placed this water in this nice circle, as we go to drop in color using this wet and wet technique, it's actually creating a boundary for the watercolor. So as it moves around, it's actually not going to flow past the water that we've placed down already. So let's get some color going here. I'm starting off with a little bit of my cadmium red. I'll work with my warmer primaries first. And if you want to know a little bit more about warm and cool primaries, again, I'll link a video below. But we'll go with the warmer ones on the left, and maybe I'll use the cooler ones on the right. So I'm wetting up my paints here, making sure that I have, moved it around, activated my paint. I've got a nice pigmented mix here. So if I have a lot of water and paint on my brush and I go to just touch the wet surface, you can see that paint just moves really quickly, and I get this nice big bloom or blossom happening. Now, if you want to have a little bit more control with this technique, you can always rinse and dry off your brush, grab a little bit more of a pigmented wash on your brush, and then drop that in. You'll see you'll get a little bit of a different effect here. So experiment with different consistencies of water and paint with different colors. Here I'm just kind of placing some swatches around. We'll do, again, the 3 primary colors. So now that I've got red down, I'm going to go over to, let's do yellow. So here I'm using my cadmium yellow, again, my warmer yellow on this left side. And so again, just kind of mixing up and activating that paint, and then just touching the canvas lightly to drop some of that in. The more you touch or the harder you press, you're going to get more paint moving around, as well as the more water on your brush. So if you want to leave some of that white space in between, you can do that by, using a little bit less water on your brush as you drop in these colors. And also, if you want to make sure that they blend and you get a nice soft, blend all the way around and these colors mixing with each other, you can always use a more wet mix and even lay down more or less water as you get started. So now that we've got that first one painted, we're going to go ahead and I'm just using my brush to refine the edge here. I use a clean damp brush just to make sure that I've got some paint flowing all the way to the edge. Again, just refining that edge, making sure I've got paint kind of flowing all the way toward the wet area that I placed down. Okay, now we'll move on to the second Jawbreaker. We're going to do the exact same technique here. Start by wetting up the area. Of course, we're going to try to avoid the Jawbreaker that we drew in front. So just kind of follow that line and wet up this entire area. And we're going to do the exact same technique where we're dropping in bits of color. But for this one, I'll use my cooler primaries. So this will be more like your cyan, magenta, and yellow. I'll be using on the right side here. Same thing, get it nice and evenly wet, look for that sheen, and once you have it as wet as you'd like, then we'll start dropping in the color. You see this magenta, it's a much kind of brighter, pinker red than the warmer red we have on the left. And then I'm going to use also a cooler yellow. This is my lemon yellow. Before I was using cadmium, and I mixed a little bit of it in here just to give it a hint of warmth, but this will be a much brighter yellow. Dropping that in here and there. Okay, I'm going to rinse off my brush, and now we'll go for a blue. I think we'll kind of want a cyan color, so I'll use my cerulean blue here for this one. So first I'm going to make sure to wet up that paint. I haven't used it yet, so get a nice puddle formed and activate that color. And then I'll pick up some of that pigment on my brush and again finish dropping that in. This is really fun and easy, and you don't have to use just the primaries. Like, pick any color palette you like. I think this is just a great way to experiment and kind of get to know your watercolors and honestly just have fun enjoying the process. All right, so we've got those two painted now. We'll want most of this to dry before we move on to the kind of center rings of the one we have up front, but I do think we will be able to paint the front edge. So we've got these circles inside, that's kind of like the inside of the Jawbreaker, and then we have this front edge, which is kind of what's left or a showing of the outside shell. So exact same thing here. Use your brush to wet this up. Now it's a much smaller area here, so you'll want to use, less water, less paint, but it's going to be the exact same technique, just kind of picking up those colors, dropping them in, and letting them move. I hope you all enjoy this project. Gosh, it's been a long time since I've had a Jawbreaker in general. And I know, like, in some places in the world, they call them gobstoppers. So I don't know, maybe let me know in the comments if you're team Jawbreaker or team gobstopper. All right, I've got that now painted, and you can see, I'm just going to kind of refine my edge a little bit, but you can see you can even move around the paper and get some of the paint to flow if you'd like. But that's really it. I'm going to make sure that I get this dried before we move on to the next step. So if you have a heat tool like I have here, you can use that, or even a hair dryer on a low setting would work if you want to speed up the drying process. Otherwise, you can just take a break, let your painting dry, and then come back for the next step. Okay, my painting is now completely dry, and so now we can start to work on these kind of rings or circles of color inside the broken Jawbreaker up front. So typically these have kind of a large center, and then different color candied layers that go all the way around. So we'll just start with that middle one and then draw some lines going around. We do want to kind of do this with a little bit of patience because we don't want our colors to touch while they're still wet. So I'm starting with the first one in the middle, and then I'll leave some white space, do another, leave some white space, do another, and try to lay color down as much as I can without the lines touching. And then we'll want this to dry in between that step and coming back to fill in the rest of the white space. So since I've still got some red here on my brush, I'm just kind of randomly placing some red rings around the Jawbreaker here and following those contour lines that I had drawn in earlier. And so we, do see part of the front of this, those lines might not go all the way around right up front. Maybe it's broke off at an angle, but honestly, you can be as detailed or messy with this step as you'd like. If you would love to see your colors, running into each other, you can, add more colors right next to each other, wet and wet. Or if you really want to be more detailed here, you could, paint each color and then let it dry and come back with a smaller brush. I'm just using the tip of my brush here and trying to paint in between the two red lines with a yellow line now, leaving white space on both sides. And then once I fill up those areas, I will let this dry and come back for another layer or two to fill up the rest of the white space. But as I'm starting to add the color here, you can start to see those colorful candied layers coming to shape here on this giant Jawbreaker. And so I think now we're at the point where we want to go ahead and let that dry while before we move on to paint the rest of it. But now we can, add a little bit more color and pizzazz to our painting here. We've got this kind of foreground happening as well as these splatters, and this is a great way to add texture to the painting. I think this is the funnest part of this project today. So we're going to start by doing just some splatters, and then we're going to use some clean water to kind of move this around. So when you're doing splatters, you want to get a nice wet mix, but you want it to be very pigmented. So try to add a lot of water to your paint, and then once you have a nice puddle, just keep activating that until you get a nice thick wet wash. This way you'll have a lot of pigment when it splatters on the page. And so then hold your brush kind of over it at an angle and then just tap downwards, and you should start to see those splatters splash across your page. And you can control it more or less the closer you hold it to the paper. But this part is a little bit messy. So do protect your work surface if necessary. You can put some on the bottom. We'll be able to kind of use all the colors that we're putting down here to form this kind of texture splatters on the Jawbreakers, as well as start to form a bit of a background. So I splattered on some of my red. Now I'm moving over to my blue. I've got my cerulean blue here. Again, trying to get that nice wet but highly pigmented wash. Splattering on the right, the left, and again, I've got my protected surface, but there's really no rhyme or reason to this. Like, have a lot of fun, and use a lot of colors here. So continue to splat until you like where you're at. We are going to add some clean water to this, so this won't be the final look, but at least get all three of your primaries on there ready to go. So now I'm washing off my brush and just splattering on some clean water. It should mix with some of those colorful splatters and kind of move some of that pigment around and start to give you, some really fun textures. And then while these splatters are still wet, we're going to use just a wet brush with some of that clean water. And by painting around the Jawbreakers, just kind of picking up that little bits of pigment as we go, you're able to, kind of create this fun, colorful surface that these Jawbreakers are sitting on. Just keep adding clean water to your brush. If you want to drop in additional colors here and there, you can, but make sure you're going right up to the edge of the Jawbreaker candy and just kind of following that horizon line that we drew in before. If you'd like, you can also add some clean water to some of the splatters on top, just kind of get some other textures. I also like to use a paper towel sometimes to blot some of them up, make some of them lighter or darker, a little bit, more textured, less textured, but again, really, really fun, messy, a great way to play with watercolor. I feel like I need a little bit of a cooler shade here in my foreground, so I'm just going to grab a little bit of cerulean while this is still wet. Again, just splattering it on, wetting my brush, and then moving that pigment around. All right, so now we're going to want this to dry again before we move on to the next step. So again, either grab your heat tool, your hair dryer, or take a break and let this dry, especially all these, layers that we just painted inside the Jawbreaker. Let that dry before we move on to the next step. Okay, so now my painting is dry. We're going to go ahead and finish the broken Jawbreaker by adding some more of these colored circles inside where we've got the white area left behind. So I've got some red there and some yellow already. I think I'll go ahead and add some blue. So I'm just using, again, the tip of my brush here. If you want to use a smaller brush, go right ahead. But here I'm, trying to add now a color touching, at least a line touching one of these colors, filling up that white space. And I'll add, a little bit of blue, and then should have maybe some more white space to fill with another color. We'll see if we have to dry it in between. And here, continue to be creative. I know I've seen even the ones that have only 3 colors on the outside, the candy themselves. They might have lots of different colors of candy layers on the inside. So orange, green, purple. You can, really have some fun here. And even though it's already a very colorful painting, maybe there's a little bit of surprise inside of your Jawbreaker. Okay, so I've got my blue there, and now I think I'll add a little bit of pink. I think this is permanent rose, opera rose that I'm using here. It's nice bright color. I think it contrasts well against the one behind it, but I'm just painting the outermost edge of the Jawbreaker. So keep going with this, adding color where you see white space. You'll eventually likely get to a point where your areas are too wet to kind of move on to the next step, which is about where I'm at here. I can add maybe one more circle, and then I'll need to make sure that this is nice and dry before I do the final step. All right, now that that is finished, I'm going to go ahead and use my heat tool to speed up the drying process before moving on to the last step. All right, my painting's now completely dry, so now I've just got a few more little white spaces left. I'll grab some additional color and just paint in the rest of these circles. Looks like I need a little bit of yellow added back here, give it some brightness. So just filling any little white spaces. Almost done here. Also maybe defining that bottom edge of where the Jawbreaker is cracked as well. So fill that in. We're really almost done here. I think it would also be interesting to add maybe a bit of a shadow underneath the 3 Jawbreakers as a final step. And so in order to do that, we'll just add a little bit of a cooler color underneath each one of these. So I'm starting by just laying down a little bit of clean water I can just right underneath and a little bit to the left of each of these. You won't have much of a shadow on the third one, but kind of right where those two meet. Just lay down a little bit of water, and then I'm gonna grab some of my cerulean blue, a little bit more watered down version of this, and just like before, I'm gonna drop that color in each of those wet spots. But this time I'm gonna go ahead and rinse my brush off, dry it a little bit on my towel, and then I'm gonna use that brush to lightly move that pigment around so it's a little bit more evenly smoothed out and kind of creating the illusion of a shadow underneath each of these pieces of candy. So again, still very loose, not overly detailed, but just gives you a little bit more dimension and helps these giant Jawbreaker candies pop right off the page. So there you go, Jawbreaker candy in watercolor. I hope you enjoyed this painting, and don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel for more projects from our Muse jar, and check out the Watercolor for Real Beginners group on Facebook. Thanks for watching, and happy painting!